A Lantern, Chapter 18. There were good crops again the next year. No longer did the dry, fluffy clouds scud high across the blue. They gathered and fell in a benediction of rains. And there were no hot winds. It put courage and high hopes into everyone. A great relief was in Abby's mind. There seemed something to live for, something ahead for the family at last. Abby had her house yard fenced now, so that the chickens could not molest her flowers. Sea blue larkspur and blood-red hollyhocks flaunted their colors against the dazzling white of the pickets. Flowers in the yard. No one but a rancher's wife who had lived in a soddy and up to whose door had come the pigs and the calves and the chickens could realize what it meant to have a fenced house yard with flowers. Life was crowded with hard work for Abby, but it was also full of compensations. There were the children, well, capable, and bright. Mac at 15 was big, overgrown, with a round, freckled face that reminded Abby somehow of his mother's fat, placid one. Mac made friends everywhere. He seemed to have that knack of fitting in with everyone. It may stand him in good stead sometime, Abby would say to Will. He lived the life of the typical farm boy who had to work by the side of his father. With 2 old coats, a cap, a muffler, and overalls tucked into knee boots, he froze in the winter hauling wood or caring for the stock. With a hickory shirt, homemade pants, galoshes, and a floppy straw hat, he roasted in the summer at the plowing or haying. Margaret, 13, was always drawing. Her sleek dark braids and gray eyes were bent above paper and pencil whenever she had leisure time. The cottonwoods and the cedars, a bit of path between the elderberry bushes, a spray of graceful goldenrod. She was always trying to get these down on paper. John, 10 now, gave evidence of being a replica of his father. Quiet, serious, uncomplaining, reminding Abby of Will when he was a boy. Isabel gave promise of becoming the family beauty, for although only 7, she was attractive with her reddish-brown curls, her brown eyes, and her fair skin, and always singing at her play in the clear childish voice, "My little lovely lady." Abby used to say to herself, "How glad I am I named her Isabel." It had been 13 years since Abby and Will had followed the trail behind Old Red and Baldy, and Abby had not been back home. "You can come back home to visit whenever you want to. I promise you that, Abby," Will had said. And she had not gone back once. But she did not blame Will. He had been helpless to keep that promise. And now this summer he said that she must go. All the plans were made, with a new brown cashmere dress in the process of construction. Abby sang at her work that after all these years she was to go back home and see her mother and Belle, Janet and Mary and the boys. And then Mac did not feel well. Dr. Hornby came and after some time decided it was to be a run of fever, typhoid. Abby put away the unfinished dress and hung over Mac's bed for weeks. He pulled through, but by the time he was strong enough to be up, the fall had come and the rains, so that the roads to Lincoln and Nebraska City were impassable, and Abby's plan for a trip back home had gone into nothing. It was only a few weeks later that Will came in from putting up the team after a trip to Weeping Water and said, "Abby, you can get out your old paints. There's a woman in Weeping Water just come from a place back east, and they say she's a real artist. They say she'll take some pupils, and I told them my wife was always wanting to try her hand." Abby was already on her way to the calfskin box under the bed, with Margaret close behind her. When she had come out with the chest and opened it, Margaret was still at her elbow, her gray eyes wide with anticipation. "Oh, Mother, I didn't know you had any paints now. You said you used to. Oh, Mother, why did you never tell me?" "Why did you want to know?" The young girl's eyes were bright, gray lights. "Oh, Mother, I want to use them. I want to go and see that woman. Oh, Mother, something in me." Will was cross. "That'll do, Margaret. You don't understand. Before you were born, when your mother came out here, she wanted to." "Will," Abby said sternly. "Hush. Of course you may try them, Margaret, and we'll take you over to Weeping Water sometime and see the artist." When Abby left the room, Margaret did not even look up. She was sorting the tubes in the little box, touching them lovingly as one would touch jewels. When Mac was 17, he went to Omaha with his father and came back changed. He was through with farm life, and he didn't care who knew it. Will said he'd better settle down and get to work, and Mac said no, he wanted to get a job in Omaha. Will said it was a boy's fool notion, and Mac said it was nothing of the kind, that he was almost 18 and he knew what he wanted. Never did Abby feel so helpless to handle the situation, so uncertain what to say or do. "He doesn't want to sweat," Will told her with sarcasm. "He wants to wear a white collar." "What do you want to do up there?" Abby was trying to keep the conversation peaceful. "Oh, I don't know just what. Get in somewhere and work up." Get in somewhere. But where and what? Will had no patience with the wild scheme. Anything that's where there's business in a big town. Anything but the farm. And Will had said that the deals had always been for the land. Abby stood between them for days. "Oh, Will, don't you see? The farm is distasteful to Mac." "A farm has been good enough for smarter men than Mac. We don't all want to do the same thing. And Will, you said you couldn't do anything just working for your father. You've always been so understanding. Then try and understand Mac." Abby talked and prayed. "Oh God, it's such little things we need help in. Such everyday affairs." She saw Will's disappointment and Mac's ambitions. Torn between the two, she could only smooth matters over for both. "Let him go then," Will said suddenly, as one could no longer hold to his point. "But I wish to God Margaret and Isabel had been boys. Maybe we could get something done around here then." He slammed the kitchen door and went down to the barn. Abby, fighting back the tears, told herself that he didn't mean it. By fall, Mac had a job at an Omaha bank. Henry Lutz knew one of the officers well, and it was through him that Mac landed the work, which consisted in part of sweeping and dusting, but which beat plowing corn all to pieces, according to the wielder of the broom and duster. Abby thought she could not stand it to see Mac leave home. All day long she had sewed shirts and mended socks for him, and all night she had stared into the dark with the worry of her boy going to the city. But with the arrival of his letters, some of her anxiety vanished. When at Christmas time he came home to spend the day, he was full of bank talk. One would have gathered from his conversation that he was at least on the board of directors. In the spring of '85, the day which had been set aside by the various governors for planting trees was legalized as a holiday, and J. Sterling Morton had given Arbor Day to Nebraska, was eventually to give it to the other states. That summer, Abby again planned the delayed trip back home. Before she was ready, word was noised about that an academy was opening in Weeping Water in the fall. It was to have a full 3-year academic course preparing students for college, with special attention to the languages. "For what anybody two ways want to talk?" Christine asked. I felt like telling her no one would object if she would stick to one way, Abby told Will. Christine's language was no better than when she had first arrived in the prairie schooner. Quite often she used both the German and the English words in the same sentence. Emma Lutz, Margaret's chum, and a year younger, was going to the academy. Henry and Sarah drove over to Weeping Water in their high-top buggy with the natural-colored maple wheels and a red tassel on the whip to get a place for Emma to board. Abby could think of nothing else when she heard it. An academy. Margaret ought to go. Margaret, at 16, with her braids of soft dark hair and her big gray eyes, her gentle manner, and her love of painting. She ought to have more schooling, to meet more young people. Several times that summer, Emil Reinmuller had come over to take her to the neighborhood socials. It worried Abby a little. Emil was 19, a blond young giant, stolid, crude, virile. What if thou art mated to a clown, and the grossness of his nature will have weight to drag thee down? Abby had read from Tennyson's Locksley Hall. Emile was no mate for Margaret with her love of the niceties of life. What could a mother do? What had her mother done? Nothing. I married the man I wanted, Abby thought. What if Margaret, with her high ideals and her painting talent, what if she should suddenly turn and say, "Mother, I'm going to marry Emile"? What could one do? The worry of it was constantly with Abby. She began trying to plan how she could send Margaret to the academy with little expense. The money for the trip back home would pay the first tuition. Will did not like the idea. "You've planned this trip for years. You ought not to give it up for her. And she's just where she can really help you now at home," he argued. "You've got yourself to think about." "Oh, no, I haven't," Abby said quickly. "I've got the children to think about." He gave in a little grudgingly. If Abby thought she could manage, and Abby knew she must manage. She took the team and drove the 10 miles to Weeping Water. When she came back, she had a place in the minister's family for Margaret to work for her board, and a dress pattern of red and gray plaid for best. It was all she could afford now, but on the way home, Abby mentally made over Margaret's old dress and one of her own, trimmed a hat and relined a winter coat. In the last half of the summer, they tied 2 quilts, as Margaret had to furnish her own bedding. They made over the clothes in accordance with Abby's previous brain convolutions, mended cotton stockings, ironed out hair ribbons, made a work apron of flour sacking, and packed and repacked the small trunk. Abby could not think of how home would be without Margaret. Quiet, gentle, fun-loving, ready to help Margaret had always been at her right hand. Will was to take Margaret and Emma in the lumber wagon so the trunks could go with them. Emma had several new dresses and a dolman, the latest thing in wraps. It was made of black watered silk, waist length in the back and to the bottom of the skirt in front, with cape-like appendages for sleeves, and rows of braid, cord, beads, and buttons rambling nonchalantly all over the whole structure. Added to this grandeur was a new gold watch on a long chain which went twice around her neck and eventually came to rest in a pocket sewed on her bosom. The pocket constructed of lace so that the gold watch would shine through. Henry Lotz was very proud of this purchase. "There's a whole horse around Emma's neck," he would announce with complacence. It sounded rather startling at first until one realized he meant no acrobatic feat, but that the price of a horse had gone into the chain. Will went over to town after Emma and her trunk first, and then the 2 came back to the farm for Margaret, who had been ready for an hour. "You're sure you'll get along, Mother?" "Why, of course I'll get along." Abby was outwardly calm and confident, while all the time there was that queer sensation of a wind rushing by. A wind she could not stop. Time going by which she could not stay. Oh, stop the clock hands. Stop time for a minute until she could think whether it was right for Margaret to go away and leave her. "Goodbye, dear." Oh, stop the clock hands. Will was calling, "Trunks in. Already in there?" Stop time for a while until she could think. "Oh, Mother, do you think I ought to go?" "Of course you ought to go." Head up, Abby was smiling. "Goodbye, then." They were down the lane road now, past the Lombardy poplars. Now they had turned east onto the main road. Margaret was dividing her handkerchief between her eyes and waving. Abby waved and smiled, as long as they were in sight. Then she turned and ran blindly into her bedroom and shut the door. And whether she has driven away in a lumber wagon or a limousine, the mother whose daughter has left her for the first time will understand why Abby Deal ran blindly into the bedroom and shut the door.